In the winter of 1995, the world woke up to a number so terrifying it made even Wall Street lose its appetite. Mexico's peso had collapsed so violently that billions of dollars in global investments evaporated in days, threatening to pull half the emerging markets into a financial black hole. And here's the punchline. While Congress argued, stalled, and waved fingers on live television, the United States government quietly pushed through a bailout so massive and so unprecedented that it earned a new title in economic history, the first modern global rescue. A bailout that wasn't only about saving Mexico, but about stopping the dominoes behind it from falling so fast the world economy would choke on the dust. But to understand how we got here, how a currency's gasp became an international panic attack, you need to picture the scene like a crowded bar at midnight. Everyone's raising glasses, bragging about their winnings, convinced the night will never end. Then one crack appears in the floorboards, just one, and suddenly the entire room plunges into darkness as the ground drops out beneath them. That was Mexico in the early 90s. Confident, celebrated, hyped to the skies. And yet beneath the shine was a slow, quiet fracture waiting to split open. You, the spectator, enter exactly at the moment the lights go out. You're not even in Mexico. You're in New York, or London, or Tokyo. And still, the collapse reaches you, grabs your collar, and shakes your portfolio awake. That's how brutally interconnected the world had become. One country stumbles, and everyone else starts looking down at their own feet, praying they're not standing on the same rotten wood. The tequila crisis didn't just surprise the world, it humiliated it. It exposed how fragile the global financial system truly was, and how wildly optimistic everyone had been about a miracle that was already cracking apart. And the most twisted part? This was only the beginning. Before the tequila burned everyone's throat, it tasted like victory. The early 1990s were Mexico's moment, the era when politicians, investors, and international cheerleaders all agreed the country was finally stepping onto the global stage as a rising star. The script was perfect. Privatizations, reforms, fresh capital flowing like champagne at a wedding no one thought could ever end. And then came NAFTA, the golden seal of approval. The world looked at Mexico and saw a future powerhouse. Mexico looked back at the world and said, "Relax, we've got this." Money didn't just enter the country, it rushed in, elbows out, fighting for a seat at the table. Wall Street banks, European funds, Japanese institutions, all lining up for a taste of what they believed was the next great economic miracle. It was the kind of frenzy where no one asks questions because the answers might ruin the party. You could almost hear the global investors chanting, "Peso strong, growth strong, keep the drinks coming." And right in the center of the celebration was the government, confidently tying the peso to a fixed exchange rate, as if economics were a matter of personal style. The peg was their fancy pair of shoes, shiny, impressive, and absolutely not designed for walking on uneven ground. But officials strutted anyway, insisting the currency was stable because they said it was stable. It was economic theater, and the audience applauded without checking whether the stage supports were cracking. Underneath all the applause, though, the numbers whispered a different story. Mexico was spending more than it earned, borrowing more than it could repay, and importing more dreams than the economy could carry. Foreign investors didn't care. They were drunk on optimism, high on returns, and blind to the fact that the miracle they adored was built on sand. If you stepped into the scene back then, you'd see the tension forming like hairline fractures in the walls, political uncertainty, overvalued currency, rising deficits, a government juggling torches while pretending the floor wasn't covered in gasoline. But nobody in the room wanted to be the first to say, "Hey, does anyone else smell smoke?" The illusion held, glowing bright, glittering, seductive, right up until the moment it didn't. Because miracles are fragile things, and this one was about to meet reality. The fuse didn't ignite with a spark. It lit with an explosion that no one in the Mexico Miracle fan club wanted to believe. In 1994, the political ground began to shake violently. A presidential candidate assassinated in broad daylight, uprising in Chiapas. Rumors swirling through financial markets like vultures circling a wounded animal. Investors, who only months earlier had praised Mexico as the crown jewel of emerging markets, now started whispering the one word that turns confidence into panic: instability. Inside government halls, officials insisted everything was fine, delivering calm messages with the shaky confidence of someone hiding a fire behind their back. The fundamentals are strong, they repeated, as if chanting it would magically refill the central bank's shrinking reserves. But investors weren't fooled. They watched those reserves evaporate as the government spent billions trying to defend the peso's fixed value. A heroic gesture that looked noble for 3 seconds and foolish forever after. Picture a dam in the desert, cracking under pressure. Instead of letting the water flow out gradually, Mexico tried patching the cracks with tape and optimism. The markets saw the tape, laughed, and kicked the dam hard. Capital began fleeing the country, an exodus so fast it felt like someone pulled the emergency exit lever on the entire financial system. Every hour, more money vanished. Every day, confidence dropped another floor. Then came the moment everyone feared. The government devalued the peso. A small adjustment, they said. Nothing dramatic. Just a gentle reset. The markets responded the way a shark responds to a drop of blood. They attacked. The peso didn't slip. It plummeted, dragging the stock market and bond markets with it, like a drowning swimmer pulling everyone down by the ankles. Mock dialogue filled the air, the kind that becomes comedy, only in retrospect. The situation is under control, one official declared, as the currency fell through the floor. Temporary volatility, another insisted, while investors sprinted for the exits. You could practically hear the global markets shouting back, "Sure, buddy, tell us another one." By the end of the month, the illusion was gone. The miracle was gone. The confidence was gone. And the peso, once held up as a symbol of Mexico's unstoppable rise, lay on the ground in pieces. The fuse had burned all the way through. The explosion was just beginning. Chaos doesn't arrive politely. It kicks the door off its hinges and storms in with both fists swinging. And that's exactly what happened when the peso collapse detonated through Mexico's economy. Overnight, interest rates didn't rise. They skyrocketed like a rocket someone forgot to aim. Businesses woke up to find their debts had doubled while their revenues had shrunk. Imports became luxury items. Shelves emptied. Jobs evaporated. And the silence after the crash? It wasn't silence at all. It was millions of people trying to understand how their lives had just been rewritten without their consent. Banks were the first to choke. Their balance sheets twisted into impossible shapes as borrowers defaulted en masse. Imagine a financial system suddenly forced to breathe through a pinhole. Lines grew outside banks, not because people wanted to withdraw money. Many simply wanted answers. But the banks didn't have answers. They barely had oxygen. Every day, more institutions wobbled, collapsing under the combined weight of bad loans, soaring interest rates, and a currency that was now worth little more than the paper it was printed on. On the streets, the crisis transformed daily life into a slow-motion freefall. Families saw savings, built over decades, dissolve in weeks. Mortgage payments exploded beyond reach. Grocery prices climbed as if powered by spite. One day you could afford a basket of essentials. The next, that same basket looked like a luxury purchase. Mothers clipped coupons with the precision of surgeons. Fathers worked extra shifts that paid less and bought less. You didn't need to read financial news to know the economy was dying. You could taste the metallic bitterness of fear in the air. And politicians? They kept performing their tragic theater. Cameras on, smiles tight, voices steady, insisting that recovery was just around the corner. As if words alone could rebuild businesses, bring back vanished capital, or reverse a nationwide loss of trust. It was like watching captains rearrange deck chairs after the ship had already snapped in two. The cruelest irony was who paid the price. Not the architects of the crisis, not the Wall Street analysts who once praised Mexico's miracle with poetic enthusiasm. Not the foreign investors who bailed out long before the floor gave way. No, those who suffered were ordinary Mexicans, people who had never speculated in exotic financial instruments or cheered artificial currency pegs. They simply lived their lives under a system that had been sold to them as strong, stable, and modern. Now they were forced to rebuild from the rubble. The meltdown wasn't just economic, it was psychological. A nation once told it was poised for greatness now stared into an abyss carved by miscalculations, overconfidence, and political blindness. Confidence didn't merely decline, it collapsed inward like a dying star. And all the while, outside Mexico, the world watched nervously. Because this wasn't just Mexico's problem anymore. The shockwaves were already racing across oceans, ready to knock on the doors of places that once believed they were safe. By the time Mexico hit the floor, the impact sent tremors straight into the marble towers of Wall Street. Traders who once toasted the Mexican miracle were now staring at screens that looked like crime scenes, red everywhere, losses piling up like wreckage after a storm. And suddenly, all the confidence, all the swagger, all the talk about emerging market brilliance evaporated. In its place came panic, the kind you can smell in a trading room. Sharp, metallic, undeniable. The meltdown didn't stay contained for even a heartbeat. Investors worldwide began dumping assets from every developing country that even remotely resembled Mexico. Brazil, Argentina, Thailand, Poland. If you were an emerging market, congratulations, you were now guilty by association. Capital flight turned into a stampede. Markets trembled like dominoes, lined a little too close together. What began as a peso crisis mutated into something uglier, a global confidence crisis. And in the middle of that storm, Wall Street began begging. Not politely, not subtly, begging. CEOs called Washington with the tone of someone realizing their multi-million-dollar bonuses were now floating down a river toward a waterfall. If Mexico falls, they warned, we fall with it. Suddenly, the same financial titans who preached free markets and minimal government intervention were pleading for the U.S. government to do something, and anything, to stop the bleeding. Washington, of course, panicked right back. Politicians who barely paid attention to foreign exchange markets were now being briefed hourly. Treasury officials stared at charts that looked like medical scans of a patient flatlining. The fear wasn't just about Mexico defaulting. It was about contagion spreading like a virus through the entire global financial bloodstream. If investors lost trust in one emerging market, they could lose trust in all of them, triggering a global downturn. Behind closed doors, the conversations turned desperate. This isn't just their crisis, one official muttered. It's ours. Because the truth was simple and brutal. U.S. banks held mountains of Mexican bonds. American pension funds held Mexican securities. Companies relied on Mexican trade. If Mexico collapsed, the blast radius would hit U.S. households, businesses, and markets with unforgiving speed. And so Washington found itself trapped in a morally awkward spotlight. Should they step in, let Mexico burn, or protect their own financial system under the guise of international solidarity? The hypocrisy hung in the air. The same voices that once celebrated globalization as a triumph of free market efficiency were now trembling at the reality that global interconnection meant shared risk, shared collapse. The screams from Wall Street grew louder, the panic in Washington more palpable. And beneath it all, one truth became undeniable. The crisis had escaped Mexico. It was now international, and someone, somewhere, was going to have to pull the emergency brake before the world economy derailed completely. The solution, if you could even call it that, didn't arrive with diplomacy, debate, or democratic consensus. It arrived like a backstage maneuver in a political thriller, crafted under fluorescent lights by men who hadn't slept in days and who spoke in the clipped tones of people trying to stop an avalanche with their bare hands. The United States Treasury, staring at a financial map that looked increasingly like a list of future disasters, decided that waiting for Congress was a luxury the world could not afford. Congress, for its part, had made its position painfully clear. No bailout. Not for Mexico. Not for Wall Street. Not for anyone. The political optics were radioactive. Why, lawmakers demanded, should American taxpayers rescue another country's mistakes? It was a fair question, right up until you remembered how many of those taxpayers' retirement accounts were tied to Mexico's survival. But fairness rarely wins political battles, and the clock was melting fast. So the Treasury took a different route, a secret passageway hidden in plain sight, the Exchange Stabilization Fund, a little-known pool of money created during the Great Depression and originally intended to defend the dollar. Not emerging markets, not collapsing currencies, and definitely not global bailouts. Yet in January 1995, that fund transformed into the lifeline for an entire nation. $50 billion, not pledged, activated. A rescue package of unprecedented size, pieced together with U.S. funds, IMF support, and loan guarantees. And the speed with which it materialized shocked the world. While Congress raged, while critics shouted about overreach and executive power, the bailout slammed into place like a fire door dropping shut to contain an inferno. Publicly, the move was sold as an act of international responsibility. Privately, everyone knew the truth. This wasn't just about saving Mexico. It was about preventing Wall Street carnage, shielding U.S. banks, and stopping a panic that was already spreading like a brush fire across continents. Stabilize Mexico, Treasury officials said, and we stabilize ourselves. The moral lines blurred. The financial ones disappeared entirely. Imagine the irony. The first great test of modern global finance, the first moment the world realized how interconnected and fragile everything truly was, ended not with cooperation or unity, but with a maneuver so controversial it nearly sparked a constitutional crisis. The bailout worked, yes, but it left behind a lingering bitterness, a sense that the rules of capitalism were flexible when the right people were at risk, a realization that money flows freely across borders, but accountability rarely does. The rescue stopped the bleeding. It steadied the peso. It pulled markets back from the cliff, but it also rewrote the playbook for every crisis that followed. From Asia in '97 to the global meltdown in 2008, the tequila crisis established a new, unsettling precedent. When the system trembles, governments will intervene, not because they want to, but because they're terrified of what happens if they don't. The first global bailout had been born, and the world would never be the same again. When the dust finally settled, Mexico emerged bruised but breathing. The bailout stabilized the peso. Confidence crept back into the markets, and the country slowly began rebuilding the economic scaffolding that had collapsed so violently. Factories reopened, interest rates cooled, investors tiptoed back in. On the surface, it looked like a recovery story, a comeback narrative governments love to tell. But beneath that thin layer of optimism lay a deeper, more uncomfortable truth. The crisis had exposed how vulnerable the entire global financial system really was. For ordinary Mexicans, the scars didn't fade quickly. Wages stayed depressed, savings remained shattered, and trust in institutions evaporated. You don't watch your life's work vanish overnight and simply move on. The psychological wound lingered, shaping how a generation thought about money, risk, and the promises of those in power. The country recovered, yes, but its people carried the memory like a permanent watermark on every financial decision that followed. The United States, meanwhile, learned a lesson it didn't want, but desperately needed. In a world where capital flows instantly and crises travel at the speed of rumor, borders don't protect you. If one emerging market collapsed, others could follow. If foreign banks fell, American banks would feel the shock. The bailout wasn't just financial strategy. It was an act of self-preservation disguised as international aid. And the rest of the world? They took notes. Governments, central banks, and international institutions studied the tequila crisis as if it were a prophecy carved in stone. They saw how fast confidence could evaporate, how currency pegs could become traps, how political instability could morph into financial catastrophe. Most importantly, they saw how bailout mechanisms, once unimaginable, could become the default response to global shocks. The irony, of course, is that the lessons were learned, then selectively forgotten. When Asia crashed in 1997, the playbook looked suspiciously familiar. When Russia defaulted in 1998, déjà vu set in. When Wall Street imploded in 2008, the pattern reappeared in high definition. Big players get rescued because letting them fail is too dangerous for everyone else. The tequila crisis didn't merely foreshadow the future, it became the template. In the end, Mexico's crisis was a warning siren for a world sprinting toward deeper financial integration without guardrails strong enough to prevent mass collapse. It showed that globalization magnifies both opportunity and fragility. It proved that optimism, when unaccompanied by oversight, becomes a loaded gun lying on the table, and it revealed a truth the world still struggles to accept. The modern financial system isn't built to prevent crises. It's built to survive them, barely, through extraordinary intervention at extraordinary cost. The tequila burned and the world tasted it. The question now is whether anyone can handle the next round.